a quick intro into what that is. Like, who is Adastra? How do we think about the hierarchy of needs? And I'll tell you about what that means. And then dive into their specific implicit bias that female founders and female investors actually face. I wanted to share what that looks like. It's kind of like I'm dabbing my toe and sharing this, so if nothing's clear, because I've just pulled some slides from a bunch of places, just talk to us, okay? Like, it's just me, just have a conversation. And then my second hat is around product market fit. And when I was talking to Michelle, she's like, yeah, throw that in, because every founder, right, every company cares about product market fit, and we have a really specific way that we think about it, so I want to share that. Okay, here we go. So our mission is to enable female-led businesses to discover their full potential and earn the equality they deserve. And part of that is because there's just such an inequality in terms of the numbers of female founders and female investors. And I'm talking specifically US. Learning a little bit more about New Zealand, I think the numbers are better here, but I still think the same implicit biases. I grew up here. I'm not going to tell you when, it was a long time ago, but I grew up here, and I can tell you that this is, at least from a Western perspective, this is pretty spread out. We haven't got to thinking about different types of countries. This is very, again, much US-centric, but what we really want, our mission is to make sure that we get to even in terms of the side of the founders, but both sides of the investment table. And a little bit about us, the story behind us. There's 3 of us as partners at Adastra. We're all investors, and I was telling Michelle and Grace over lunch that about 3.5 years ago, Alison, my partner, who's been in VC for over 15 years, and I were sort of sitting there chatting, and we realised that we had no women in our portfolios, which is pretty shocking and embarrassing to admit. So we are sitting on various different boards. We have done so much due diligence. I'm the first to push someone who's on the border in terms of a steering committee into let's make sure we look at women as well, but I hadn't invested in a single one, which is pretty crappy, right? And I'm like, well, why is that? And so we roll up our sleeves and we try to figure out why. Rather than just saying we're going to go ahead and invest, we're like, what is going on here? And we discovered a bunch of stuff, which is where this whole implicit bias research came from. And since then, we formed Adastra Ventures. Our entire goal, our entire portfolio, I'm proud to tell you there's 14 women that we've invested in now that are incredible female founders. But we go through a process by which we try and unlock and remove implicit bias so that they show up differently. My second partner in my business, Sylvia, runs something called Women's Venture Conference. Something like that. 500 to 600 women show up in San Diego every year. She's been running it for 7 or 8 years. The last 2 years we ran an investor workshop that said, all you investors, we changed the way that we look at women, we changed the dialogue, and here's what we did. So now we have about 30 to 40 investors who've actually gone through our program as well. And our goal, again, is to get to even. The way that we think about it is essentially this idea that you have to really understand what's going on. You have to have this awareness in terms. I'm going to switch to this and then come back to that slide. You have to have this awareness of the implicit biases that exist. So our framework is first you've got to understand that these exist. Then once you've understood what these implicit biases are, we're all affected very differently. Each one of us, as men and women, have our personal experiences. So the implicit biases that kind of stops me in my tracks is going to be different to the one that impacts Michelle and everyone else here. So you've got to understand the impact on you. And then we have a set of tools that we actually take people through and say, this is how you actually combat it. This is what you do. So when you're faced with it in the moment, instead of kind of going, I just can't believe that just happened, and I'm sure we've all had those moments where you just literally are sitting there kind of going, I can't believe that person just said that to me. Or, you know, you're embarrassed. We had one woman who, just before she went up to pitch, someone sort of tapped her on her ass, right? And you're like, I mean, it literally, I mean, she froze, and I could see it, because I didn't know that it happened before she went on stage. But she's on stage, and she's like shaky, because who's going to sit, anyway, I won't go down that path, because I think we're being live streamed. But these are the kinds of things that knowing how you react to certain stimulus, you need to be able to kind of be prepared. So our whole goal is be prepared. So going back to this, and here's my friend. Come on in. And I told you that you can't sneak in like without. She said, "I'm going to sneak in. Isn't that a great female leader?" Sort of statement to make. I'm like, that's not going to happen. So
quietly and unannounced.
just one sentence on who you are, real fast.
Well, I'm Arika Martin. Hi everyone. I'm from California originally. I work in the tech industry. Currently at Foresight Bar, head of digital savings, launching a new initiative. And I do know you out at Wargo.
Yeah.
And I know Vidya through Collaborative Game, a wonderful, amazing coaching community in UX.
Yay. Welcome.
Thanks.
So just going back, so the framework is what we talked about. The pillars and what we stand for is we actually turn around the way that you think about a traditional accelerator or incubator, at least the ones that get in the States. We actually start with an individual strengths versus the milestones and some of the go straight into product market fit, go straight into business model, go straight into funding. We actually believe that you're creating a business, you've kind of gone out and said, I am changing the world in this particular way. Like, what does that mean for me? And what do I individually, what are my strengths and superpowers that I can rely on? So everything about this starts with the individual. So we sort of wipe out traditional programming and start with the person. We really believe in highlighting. If you follow us, you'll see that we highlight female founders and investors. And then we do things like this because we want to tell everybody like that you can change the way that investment is made. We've got a bunch. Our investments, I told you we've got 14 women. It spans everything from fintech to there's med devices, there's water, there's social impact in there. There's a bunch of different things. So our investment thesis is pretty broad. It's a female founder, and she is building her business in a very specific way that she uniquely is positioned for. And we also have these boot camps. There's one coming up just this morning. We picked the new 12 women who are going through our cohort, and they're amazing. And then we do things like this, like workshops and talks all over the place.
Do you generally invest at seed or A? What is your?
It's at seed, and there's two different levels. We write checks usually when they come into our program between 25 and 50, and then follow on funding up to 500. So that's the range.
So there's a program, and then there's it's like an accelerator.
Well, we used to call it an accelerator, and without kind of getting into you're right, but we don't know the new name of it.
Okay.
But we wanted to sort of work alongside our female founders. But these women who you saw in our portfolio, they've actually gone through our accelerator. It used to be called our accelerator.
Wow, it's in Kingston.
Yeah. They're amazing, and I can tell you, I can spend the next hour telling you about these women. Mm-hmm. So if you ever want to know, and please follow us, join us, and you can be part of this community.
Vidya, why the hesitancy around using that word, accelerator?
The reason, because we joke that we should call ourselves a de-accelerator instead of an accelerator, because a lot of the times, and we were talking about this over lunch, I am a Techstar mentor, and there's specific milestones, and you're put on a track to do certain things in a certain period of time, and it works really well for a lot of companies. The companies that we choose, we want them to run their businesses based on what they actually want to do, not a formula, which means that you've got to stop. And we have to find a different way that we say, let's figure out where the gap actually is. And for you, it might be product. For someone else, it might actually be like, we worked over 2 months to fix someone's cat table because she made some, and in the end, she made some mistakes, but it takes time. We can't do that in 3 days. You've got to have really painful conversations. You've got to coach someone on how to have that conversation. You've got to get the right lawyer to represent. So all of these things are like, we will focus where we want you to focus. So if you can come up with a name that means all that, could you tell me? Because we're strong. But we're thinking venture builder right now, but even that's like a little, because we're not responsible for like your company, you are. What we're responsible for is helping you not make certain mistakes that we can see. Go make new ones, but we can help you not make certain ones. Yeah, and we can fix the things that we can tell you are going to kind of stop you in tracks.
Yeah.
Okay, so that was just a little bit of who we are. I wanted two things. First is hierarchy of needs. And so this is kind of your life, right? I mean, this is kind of like the average life of an entrepreneur, like, you know, and maybe you recognize this because there's such highs and lows. And like, you know, depending on the hour that I can talk to one of our founders, it can be like the best of the best, and then it can just be like, I can't handle this anymore. This is the way it works. Does that resonate with anyone? No? Like any female leader, pretty much, yeah. So remember back to Maslow, right? Remember back to sort of high school when we learned about sort of Maslow's hierarchy of needs. And we have this like basic need around like, you know, you kind of get to your food and your water and sort of safety, you know, the basic need. And then you can sort of like move up to sort of self-actualization. So what we wanted to do was to actually we started thinking about this from an entrepreneur perspective. And we said, really, we see everyone sort of jumps to the money. Like everyone feels like you've got to get to the funding. You've got to get to the dollars and you're pitching and you get so much feedback and so many different ideas and you're kind of bombarded with all this, which is why your life looks like that, because people are not short on telling you what to do, whether that's a board, a new investor, someone you meet, someone on the team. It's just too much. We think that's the last thing that you should do. What we want to do is to get you to a place where you actually have this really core self-awareness of what drives you as a business. Then we want to layer on product market fit, because that's our safety umbrella, right? If you understand the problem you're solving and you clearly understand who you're solving it for, these two are the base of any product. And then we layer on the business model. It's like, okay, we've got the customer, we've got the problem set. Now let's actually look at how we want to build this business. Then you have to surround yourself by the right people because you've got the core. Then you can move on to like, how are you going to tell the story? What's the brand? How are you going to communicate outwards? Once you've got all that, I can tell you the money will come. And I know that sounds sort of a little trite, but when you get all of that right, an investor sees it. The problem is, you ask for money and immediately we see holes in any one of these. And I don't even tell you how many pitches I've seen, but we get pretty good at writing companies off, because if you're an investor, you're saying no to 98% of the companies that you see. And so you're just looking for a reason to say no. And what you want to do is you want to get this so completely right that the right investor will actually see that little piece of the place. So that's what we work on. This is our hierarchy of needs. This is how we think through our I'm going to just do accelerator in air quotes because I don't know what to call it. Make sense? So I wanted just to show you this. We just think about it a completely different way. So the second thing I want to tell you about is the implicit bias, and this is kind of the core. It's where everything started. And you know, and this is sort of like a silly little cartoon, but it's sort of like, you know, this is sort of the reality. You know, you're probably like doing this, right? It's like, I'm doing a little cooking, I'm doing a little baking, and I'm managing a $2 billion fund, right? I mean, our lives as women are just juggling a bunch of different things. And the reality today is that this is 2019 figures. We haven't updated it. But out of $109 billion invested, you can see that there's less than 3% that are all female founding teams, and about 12% that are mixed, usually with a co-founder. I'd say half the companies that we see, maybe 40%, have, if there's a female CEO and founder, there's usually a male co-founder with her. CEOs of Fortune 500 companies, that's the figures, as again of 2019. There's 467 men, and there's 33 women. So just the patterns that we see, the information that we see is incredibly skewed. And then if you take a look at the founders of these companies, not the CEOs, there are no female founders of a Fortune 500 company. So we need to change that. And so why is this happening, right? So again, I've sort of skipped a whole bunch of stuff. You're going to come on this journey with me, so just talk about implicit bias. And the thing we want to tell you about implicit bias is it's not malicious, it's not on purpose, it's not something that anyone is doing. We all have it because we all grew up in sort of this society. But what happens is there's this unintentional and ongoing reinforcement of the status quo. And so these stereotypes that exist make us behave in certain ways, and I'll tell you from an investor perspective, it makes you ask questions differently and see women businesses differently than male businesses. We don't need to do it, and that's the reason why we didn't have any women in our portfolio, because we were implicitly just saying they're not on the same level. This is really, really hard to discern, right? I think there's so much, and if we look at 2020, well, so much went on. But a lot of the movements, they're more overt. Implicit bias is not. So it's really tricky to put your finger on it. The problem with it is that it's the second line here, this over-attribution. You tend to ascribe too much when an implicit bias, when you're impacted by an implicit bias. You over-ascribe to you being the one to blame. And it can lead to a lot of, going back to that hierarchy with self-awareness, you really need to be quite strong. I mean, you already are incredibly strong as female founders. This is not an easy thing to do, but you've got a lot coming at you. Yeah.
What does that mean? Your second bullet point?
Over-attribution of behaviours to the bias.
Yeah, well, in practice, how would that play out?
So what you can say, let me give you an example. Let's talk about an implicit bias. Can you hold that for a second? I'll come back to the example because I'm going to jump ahead and come back. So I will come back to that, okay? So I wanted to show you the slide, then I'm going to come back to your question. When we did the research, we found there was all these different categories of potential bias that existed. We took out all the things that were explicit. For anything that was an explicit bias about, sort of the jokes or all the rest of it, we took all of that out. And what we went to was actual research papers that came out of universities, came out of various different organizations, and we bucketed it into these 9 implicit biases, of which there's 3 columns. So the first is this idea of how people see you, your own identity. And the 3 areas are around leadership, emotion, and focus. So I'm going to tell you what these are in a second and come to your question. How people talk to you and how they interact with you as a woman. And this goes to how they think about you building new ideas, how it looks like to be successful, and it's based on what you know. And then it's internal. There's 3 sets of internal biases around your own ability, your own potential, and your own performance. So here's the example of over-attribution, okay? So people think of a man when they think of a leader. So this research comes from right when kids are very young, and you take a look at sort of 3 or 4-year-olds. When you ask them to pick who is a leader, and the researchers, they showed a whole bunch, about 100 kids' pictures. When they're 3 and 4 years old, they tend to identify with their own gender. So a girl will pick a girl as the leader, a boy will pick a boy. You get to 7 years old, and 90% of all children pick a man. And so this idea of over-attribution of bias is this idea that, well, of course, they don't see me as a leader. And so you start actually overcompensating for the fact that you're not in that position. And in your head, you haven't leveled off the ability to say, I don't have to come across, I don't have to overperform. I'm going to act differently because I understand this is happening. Okay, sorry, that was a long way to get back to your question, but I kind of wanted to wrap it up. This idea about men are less emotional, women are overly sensitive. I think there's a ton of research that you've seen as women leaders come across as unlikable. I don't need to go into that. There's a ton of research around that. And then this idea about men prioritize their careers, and a woman's career is one of several priorities. And I know from a corporate perspective, and I'm a little older than all of you guys here, but I just remember this being, if you're taking a look in a room, looking at who you're going to promote, the conversation about is she going to stick at it, unfortunately came up a lot. Okay, so how people see you potentially as not the leader. What we want to do is to show you, I remember that the framework of impact and action. Female founders, when you come up, announcing yourself as a CEO, you don't have to make a big deal of it, but you need to actually say you're the CEO, because when you don't do that, people assume you are not. When there is a co-founder situation, who you are, how you announce yourself, practicing the 2 or 3 sentences by which you say, this is who I am, these are my credentials. So expect you to be not seen as a leader, prepare for it and have that statement. What it gives you is the tool to be able to show up in a way that starts to remove some of this bias, and people are going to talk to you differently. Those are examples of the kinds of tools that we would have. The next one is how people talk to you. It's really interesting, this idea about men are more likely to think out of the box and have big visions. This comes out of, has anyone seen the research around promotion and prevention? Has anyone heard of that? Okay, so about 2 years ago, this researcher, she came out of Penn. She went to a conference full of VCs and pitching. The 170 companies pitched. And what she looked at was the types of questions that were asked of men founders and women founders. And what she found is that men tend to get asked, and again, there's research behind this and data, what are called promotion questions. So a promotion question is a question where you're asked, well, how is this going to grow, right? How big is this going to be? How much more, how much runway do you have? Women tend to ask prevention questions, which is, have you thought about this risk? Have you thought about this problem? What happens is, if you're teed up, you've got 10 minutes on stage, people are throwing how big is your company going to be, and you get to answer that. If you get asked, have you thought about this risk? As women, we're going to answer the question. And we're going to tell you exactly how we've thought about this risk. In fact, they'll tell you for 10 minutes how they've thought about every single problem and how they're going to overcome it. At the end of the day, you now have had 10 minutes of someone who's told you how safe their company is, and you've had 10 minutes of a person who's told you how great and big and successful their company is going to be. That's why one of the attributes to why women don't get funded as much. If you're asked a prevention question, here's another example. Recognize it as a prevention question, answer it in 1 or 2 sentences, and then pivot it, take control, and talk about how you're going to grow. When you recognize it and you can label it as a prevention question, you can do something about it.
So good. That's so good.
Yeah,
that is so good. That happens. I found that, I read that a long time ago, and when I raised money, I didn't think about it, but I do remember spending a lot of time explaining how I'm going to avoid this high cost of acquisition, as an example, right? Or like how are you going to avoid this risk or that risk. I wish I had turned that question on.
Yeah.
Yeah.
You still can. You still.
Yeah, I mean, it's what, rounds to raise in the future. So yeah, I'm writing it down. I'm going to remember that next time. Mm-hmm.
And part of this is being thrown these questions and being able to respond, having a practice. So we talked about this piece. Men are smarter than women. Women have a higher level of intellectual ability. I know some of these sound trite, and we try to make them really approachable. But part of the problem, the research says, you're not going to be taken at face value. You know, you're simply not. That you're going to have the data. You're going to have the numbers. A lot of women don't have the financial numbers at their fingertips. You just have to. You've got to be able to spit them out and be able to kind of meet people where they're expecting you to be, because the expectation is that you won't know the numbers, and so that bias is confirmed. And then the last one, how we see ourselves, is this idea about that we do this to ourselves all the time. I can tell you I do this to myself too. This ability to need experience and data before taking a risk or trying something new. We see women founders wanting to research the heck out of things before they make a call or make a decision, because you feel like you've got to really understand it, you've got to check every box, you've got to cross every T. We're starting to take ourselves out. The number of people I've seen, let's just say it's 1,000 pitches and about 700 are men. When I do due diligence, let's just narrow that down to 100. Men are about sort of 70% certain when they feel like they can sort of say, we've got the ball. Women need to be like 98% certain, sometimes 100%. I will get back to you is the most common answer I get. Versus, and that's fine, you can say I don't know and I need to get back to you, but when you're reasonably certain, say I'm reasonably certain and let me just confirm that later, not shut yourself off and take yourself out of the running. The interesting thing about this, like this full value and this underestimation of our own abilities, this last bit of research I'll tell you about is from HP. They looked at a couple of hundred people going for jobs, and this again is corporate, but it applies. when they looked at the resumes of the men who applied for these jobs, they had between 50 to 70% of the qualities. The women had 90+% of the qualities. We take ourselves out of the picture all the time. And the last one is potential. We tend to think about all the things that can go wrong. We tend to want to make sure that everything is thought about. We need to push ourselves a little more out of our comfort zone, and we need to figure out how we can do that. So,
just quickly on that abilities point, I studied engineering and did physics and maths at university, and that's a very kind of male-centric kind of zone. But I didn't stick around because of many different reasons. But one thing I have noticed, I think, with women is that you go out and articulate the full value of what we need to bring to the table. It's true, but it's also this feeling that you need to be the very best.
yes.
You know, if you're a woman in tech, you're not just understand what's going on. You are the best because you have something to prove almost. You know, because you don't want to be spoken down to. You don't want to be, asked questions and that kind of thing, which makes it even harder because you're not aiming for, you're for something kind of reasonable. Like I know what I'm talking about. You're aiming for, I am perfection. Perfection.
I am perfect.
Yes.
Yep, that's right.
And
That's
it's
exactly
really
right.
difficult.
It's absolutely true. And I had a physics degree from Vic, and so one of two women in that class, so I know exactly what you're talking about. And I also know that perfection but it's also a little bit in our heads, which is why we're saying about this implicit bias. We're telling ourselves we have to be perfect. No one else is. An investor doesn't expect you to be. Your customers don't expect you to be. And because we're putting these requirements on ourselves, we can push further. Recognizing where you can push and where you need to be comfortable goes back to that self-awareness. Because take you two founders, you're going to have very different profiles of what you're comfortable pushing. If you don't know what those are, you're going to if you push on the wrong ones, it's going to be even worse because any experience is going to confirm the bias and you go, I should never have done that, I knew I shouldn't have done that, I'm never doing that again. So with that self-awareness, you may push yourself on the ability piece and you may be pushing yourself on the performance piece and you're more comfortable because you've got more room to do that. It's really important we understand where we're coming